Good day, dear learners. Today we are going to do a lesson on hermeneutics. We are going to do two lessons actually on hermeneutics. So this is part one. Hermeneutics is the topic that is closely related to normative sources. So it is actually like dealing with normative sources. So that's why before we start with hermeneutics itself, we need to have a quick overview of the topic of normative sources. So normative sources in religion studies are divided into three categories: inspiration, oral tradition, and sacred texts. Okay, so like these are the main normative sources that the adherents of the religion they refer to them when they are seeking any kind of advice or any responses to their questions. The inspiration, it is when it is believed that a a person's breath is taken by the breath of the supreme being or a divine power. And inspiration itself is categorized into two categories: divine and contemporary. Divine inspiration refers to that kind of inspiration that is directly received from the origin or from the supreme being or from the ultimate reality. And in that sense, all the religious founders, they are believed to receive the divine inspiration because they are the direct recipients of this divine message. Whereas contemporary inspiration refers to that kind of inspiration that uh, happen that is happening in the recent times or has happened relatively recently. So in this case, we will be saying that, or we can say that, for instance, the teachings of the Baha'i faith, they can be categorized under this heading because in the world history of the development of the religions, we say that the religions, they have been developed over a long period of time. However, the Baha'i faith the Baha'i faith emerged only in the midst of 1800s. So compared to the entire period of the development of the religions. So 150 or 200 years is a relatively like short period in this process. So that's why all of the religions that date back to 150 to 200 years and even shorter than that, they can be categorized under contemporary, can be seen as the contemporary inspiration. Basically, like you can add here African initiated churches, neo-Hindu movements, Rastafarianism, and so on. Also, contemporary inspiration may refer to the inspiration that is happening between or where the intermediaries are used. For instance, like the scholars or the later scholars, they are inspired by the teachings of the founders of the religions or the earlier scholars. So that's why they are not receiving the direct um, inspiration from the divine origin, but so they are receiving an inspiration from the interlocutor, in this case, for instance, like the founders of the religion. Then the second type of the normative sources is oral tradition, and this is the transmission of the uh, texts from one person to another, or the transmission of the teachings from one person to another, or from one generation to another by word of mouth, and it was the most essential normative source that was used before the invention of writing. But after the invention of writing, obviously the sacred texts replaced the oral tradition largely. And at the moment, like most of the times, whenever we speak about normative sources, the very first thing or the most important category that is recognized in this regard, it will be definitely a sacred text. The sacred texts together, they also they can be divided into two main groups: primary and secondary. Primary, it will be referring to all of those uh, important or the essential scriptures of the religions. You can we'll speak here about, we can speak here about the Quran, the Bible, the Tanakh, the Vedas, the Pali Canon, whereas in the secondary sources, we can, or secondary texts, we are talking mainly about the commentaries, which are the explanations of the primary texts. So having said this, let's move to our main topic for today, which is hermeneutics. Okay, so what is hermeneutics? Hermeneutics, it is the interpretation or the science of the interpretation of normative sources or sacred texts. So we are usually we are dealing with the sacred texts here, but of course, like, the interpretation is not restricted to the scriptures only. We also can do the interpretation of the other two categories of the normative sources that we have just mentioned now, which are the oral tradition and inspiration. Interpretation, hermeneutics comes from Greek hermenein, which means interpret. So in the study of hermeneutics, okay, like, we have to consider all these factors in order to make to have a better understanding of the sources. What type of writing is it? Is it a parable, allegory, fable, fact? Is it prose or poetry? When was it written? Okay, like, the time is very important. Who wrote it? Who was it written for? And what were the circumstances at the time it was written? Okay, so like, all of these factors, they should be considered for a better understanding of the scriptures. And circumstances change from one generation to the next, which means that each new generation has to interpret the normative sources for its own time. Okay, so in the study of hermeneutics, we can consider two different approaches: conservative and progressive. So let's go through each one of them in detail. Conservative approach insists on a strict adherence to the words of the normative sources, regardless of the age of the source. Okay, so like, if you can recall an information from grade 10, let's say, okay, so that you will see that it is closely related to fundamentalism, because remember, fundamentalism refers to a strict adherence to the scriptures or to the text by taking the literal meaning of the text. So in this case, we also say that the most extreme conservative style of interpretation is called fundamentalism. And like, in this approach, we are taking the texts absolutely literally, and like, without any kind of realization that it can be interpreted somehow differently. And an example of a conservative approach would be this kind of phrase or this concept that men must still dominate women in all respects today. As you know, most of the scriptures, they in text, they were written at the time when there was this kind of like understanding that women are inferior to men. So that's why like this is a very obvious type of interpretation that can be used in conservative approach. Obviously, there are a lot of points of criticism that like we can address like for the conservative approach. There is no sense of history, meaning that there are no concepts of like before and after. And also like there is a like lost like a broken link between the past and the present, which make most of the times um, the relevance of the texts that were written so many years or so many centuries ago absolutely void for many adherents, and that's why they start seeing some of the messages or some of the texts as outdated and like that they do not fit to the current society, contemporary society. Okay, so what about progressive approach now? So progressive approach, obviously, like in a progressive approach, it's also like very important to uh, to to get to the original message. However, we have to recognize that we have to distinguish between the historical circumstances and the present times. So in this regard, we can say that we have to distinguish between the wrappings, which are the historical circumstances surrounding the source, and the gift itself, which is the essential message. So the message, we have to focus on the message itself. Okay, like what God or what the Supreme Being is telling us in this text or in this verse. Uh, the uh, the time when it was revealed and all of those events that were happening at those times, they are just a beautiful wrapping that to make this the gift or the message more presentable and more appealing. It's not more than that. So that's why we have to focus more on the message itself. And compared to what we have said about the domination of men over women in the conservative, as an example for the conservative approach, so we can see here that in the supporters of the progressive approach would see it in a different light, saying that it is more about the establishment of justice and compassion, and like there is no such a thing as men should be dominating over women in all regards. However, like no matter how appealing progressive approach may sound to many of us, there are also some points of criticism for the progressive approach as well. And this is again like sometimes what may happen that in order to apply or to make it fit to contemporary society, to contemporary society, we may lose the also like the link with the original message. Okay, so like where we are saying that okay, so like that is the historical circumstances are not important, and again like that's it is not what was like it's not meant whatever it used to mean in the old times, so on. So that's why like there is also like that the progressive hermeneutics, there must be also like a balanced way to have a position, to take a position where we keeping a distance from both past and present, and we are able to merge them, and we are seeing it in a balanced, more balanced way. And some important points that we need to consider here is that the teachings do not remain the same throughout time, because the ways of interpretations are different. Obviously, as we mentioned, there are different types of conservative approach, progressive approach. Obviously, there are there may be also like some people who try to merge these to be to stay away from the both extremes. But the difference in interpretations also may be different from culture to culture. A person who lives in let's say like in the Far East may see the same text or may interpret the same text in an absolutely like different way compared to a person who lives in the United States. According to hermeneutics, also like no religion can claim that their sacred text is the only one that is true. Obviously, like there are many interpretations. Like even within the same religion, for the same text, we may find different types of interpretations, because like they may change based on the, as we said, like the culture, the time, the people themselves. So that's why like there is in the context of religion studies, no religion can be seen or can claim that their interpretation is the only one that is correct. And it also like hermeneutics depends largely on the reader as well. Like imagine there is one speech, the same speech that is going to be delivered by two different people. One person who is delivering that speech is like very skillful and equipped with all the necessary skills of a wonderful orator and a public speaker, whereas the second one is not good enough in that field. So again, like when after both of these speeches are delivered, obviously like the impact of the speech which is presented by the first speaker will be much different, and like it will sound more profound and concise compared to the speech that was delivered by the second speaker. So that's why obviously like the even it may be dependent on the reader, because the reader has the power to change the meaning of the sacred text to suit the needs of the society. Although the texts were created a long time ago, they will always be relevant for religious communities. So basically, this is all about the hermeneutics, or the part one of our lesson on hermeneutics. What I also want you to keep in mind that there are three steps that are that are very important in the understanding of and applying of the hermeneutics in our lives. The first step can be called, you can categorize it as the observation. Step number two, it is interpretation, and step number three, application. I'll try to explain it to you, to give you an analogy so that you may understand it better. Imagine you are sick and you are going to a doctor. So the doctor, after listening to you, like whatever you like complaints you have, so he starts checking up and like examining your conditions. Okay, so like all the symptoms. So this is the observation process. Then, like after making his or her observations, okay, like based on his background knowledge, okay, like about like, different types of illnesses, he interprets it into a diagnosis. Okay, so like, and he says, okay, so like that you based on these like symptoms and your complaints, or like you have a swine flu or COVID-19 or whatsoever. And then after the interpretation is done, now the time for the application. What would be the application in this case? So the doctor will prescribe a treatment for you in order for you to heal in the nearest time. However, obviously, this like the application or the prescription of the treatment, it cannot be exactly the same for all the patients who have been diagnosed with the absolutely same illness. Because in this regard, we also have to consider that there are different personal conditions of the patients. For instance, like one can be a diabetic, the other one can be allergic to penicillin, and so on. So that's why, of course, like the treatment will not be the same or will not fit all the learners, or how we say that one size will not fit all. So that's why like we have to be very careful in terms of the doctor needs to be very careful in terms of the application. So using this analogy in the study of hermeneutics, so when we have our texts in front of us, the scripture, we are trying to find out, we are trying to make our observations. Okay, so like what is written in the scriptures, like what the message God tries to convey to us, and so on. Okay, so like obviously, like we are trying to do as much research as possible if that topic is particularly important to us. Then, after making our observations, now we are doing our interpretation of these messages. Okay, so like whether we are interpreting them literally, like, or we are again like using some different by using some of the hermeneutical principles, we are making some other findings. By the way, we are going to speak about the hermeneutical principles and how to apply hermeneutical principles in the study of the scriptures in the next lesson. So this is the step 2, interpretation. And finally, maybe the most important step that we are taking, which is application. And in this regard, the application will be that we will try to implement whatever we learned, whatever we have found from our observations and interpretations in our lives, in order to become better people, in order to become a better followers of our religion, in order to implement the teachings in more efficient way, and so on. So this is basically it about hermeneutics. I hope that you have found this lesson useful for you, and we will continue with part 2 in the near future. Keep well and goodbye.